I'm here with Jule Kim. Thank you so much for being here, Jule. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ryan. So my name is Jule, and I am a executive coach. I love helping women executives become strong, confident leaders.
Jule, I understand that you are also very familiar with mistakes that people make when they're in an interview. Can you share a little bit about that?
Sure, I would love to. So I like to help people prepare for any upcoming interviews. Not all people are able to adequately communicate the value. There's usually no question that they actually have the required experience, but sometimes people aren't so good at actually displaying that experience in a clear way. So there are, I would say, maybe 7 mistakes I commonly see across the board. And this isn't just from my own experience. This is from people I've heard them complaining to me, people who are actually trying to give people jobs. And the people just, like the candidates just bomb. It's so terrible. So these are the 7 that I've noticed, and I'll just go from the first one, and then we can maybe discuss along the way. So I would say the number one mistake I see is candidates who take too long to get to the point. They ramble, there are too many details, it's overwhelming, and overall, it makes it very hard for the interviewer to actually understand what is the point or what is the gist.
That sounds like a common problem for when our students give speeches too, right? Or whenever they're in any kind of communication situation that's high stakes. It's very difficult when you're put on the spot like that to have a clear plan, execute that plan. What advice do you have to help people overcome this rambling problem?
Well, my number one advice is that you have to prepare and you have to write it out. There's no winging it. You can't just think through these things or these scenarios on your own. Like you would want to go find like the most common interview questions out there on the internet. There are like a ton of these lists. Go look at least 3 of them and then start writing out your answers to these. The act of writing out your answers in advance will show you where your weaknesses are. And so the typical advice that I give the people who work with me in, one of these interview sessions is start with the main gist. Just if the interviewer, for instance, asks you, tell me about a time where you dove deep and solved the problem. And so where most people, I think, follow this outdated advice, you've probably heard of this, the STAR framework, right? The STAR framework says, lay out the situation, the task, the action, and the results. And I'm like, that is the absolute wrong approach. It takes too long for people to get to the meat of the
Oh
suggestion.
no, we've been teaching that. I've been teaching the STAR method. This is so great that you have a different perspective. So that takes too long to get to the point, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Because what happens is most people will get totally bogged down in the details of the situation that just don't matter. Like, and they end up flooding the interviewer with all these details, like these dumb, trivial, like insignificant facts about the situation that actually have nothing to do with like the main point, right? So I would say actually start with the problem. So, back when I worked at X, I faced this problem. And then you want to maybe back up into the context a little bit. Like our goal was to do this, but we were facing this. So you want to start with the problem. You then want to talk about your investigation. You then want to explain your realization, and then what action you took, and then what impact that action had. So again, it's not so much about results. We want to talk about your impact. And so the problem with the STAR framework is you end up talking in a means of as if you're just reading through a to-do list. That is not going to help you highlight your strengths in an interview.
And you just gave us a new framework that started with problem. Can you go through that framework again? Because I want to make sure that our audience has this in their mind so that they know that they're emphasizing the most important thing, but they're starting with problem, right?
Well, there are 2 main ways that I recommend people to start. So I would actually recommend most people to start with the gist, like the bottom line. So for example, I was able to automate much of the manual tasks and reduce the workload by 70%. And then you would say, here's how I did that, right? And you would say, this is the problem we faced. So and so were taking like 3 months or 6 months to do something. I came in and investigated, like, why is this going on? We're getting a lot of requests as to, what's taking so long. We're getting a lot of tickets, and that, of course, is a load on customer service. So you want to lay out the problem. Then you want to say, here's the thing I investigated. Here are the things I noticed. And then when I really went deep into the analysis or, whatever fact-finding mission, you then say, this is what I uncovered. And therefore, because of this, this is what I realized. So it's problem, investigation, realization, action. So what action do you take? And then as a result of your action, what impact did that have?
Do I need to go through each of the step of the formula that was just laid out? Or do I need to pick out, and can I just give like 3 of the steps instead of all 5 or something like that?
I would say you would ideally go through all of the steps. And that's because you need to explain your thought process through the entire situation, right? Like, what was happening? What was the problem? What were your thoughts and discoveries that led you to take the actions? And then whatever actions you took, what was the result? But not just result as in, oh, we did this and we saw this. Like, you need to explain on an impact level. So if you reduced turnaround time by 70%, then what happened? So you want to keep following it through, and everything about your interview process really needs to be about the impact that you've driven at your work. So it's the same issue with resumes. Most resumes make the mistake of reading like a to-do list instead of really driving home the significance of what they were able to deliver in their job. But out of that whole framework that I mentioned, I would say it's probably most key to highlight the problem and then the impact, those 2 pieces.
That is fantastic advice. You mentioned there's other kinds of mistakes that a candidate might make. What's another one?
Okay, this is super classic, and I know I used to make this mistake. So I'm going to ask this to you, actually. What has been your guidance so far on how to handle this question of what is your greatest weakness?
That is a very difficult question to answer. I usually would advise that candidates admit and own up to their genuine weakness and put it in language and context to show how they address and manage that weakness. For example, if a genuine weakness is I sometimes fail to connect with colleagues, or I sometimes fail to work with colleagues and I'd rather just do it myself, explain how you're working on that specific kind of weakness and what you've done to help force yourself to reach out to colleagues for help when you actually need it.
Yeah, that's pretty in line with what I would say as well. The typical thing that I see candidates do here that's really not great is they fail to actually own up to a real weakness, right? They're following that outdated advice of trying to spin a strength as a weakness. So super common response is, oh, I'm overly perfectionistic. Like, I can't stand not doing a good job. It's like, oh my God, come on. Like, get off it. Like, be real. So I would say you want to pick like a genuine weakness, something that you struggle with in the workplace and maybe just even in overall life. There's nothing wrong with it. So you do want to acknowledge, right? Own up to it, like you said. So acknowledge what that weakness is. But the second part of the whole process is to explain why this is an issue and then demonstrate your understanding why this is an issue for other people who have to work with you. So let's say, for example, you have a habit of interrupting people. Now, the short and let's say barely adequate answer would be saying, you know what, I know that I have a habit of interrupting people when they're talking. I'm really working hard on doing that. Well, this might fall short of the mark because you're not really explaining that you actually understand why that's a problem. And then when you say I'm working really hard to address that, you're not actually giving anything tangible as to how you're doing that. What steps are you taking? What are you actually doing to try and minimize the interruptions you're, sort of bombarding other people with? So it's a 3-step process for this one. Acknowledge, explain why this is an issue, not just for you, but for other people. And then really lay out the tangible steps you're taking to resolve this.
So acknowledge, explain why it is an issue, and then lay out the tangible steps that you're taking to resolve that. That sounds like a really clear framework to help people describe their weaknesses. Does it have any pitfalls? Does it have any parts where people sometimes struggle with? Do they fail on one of those three steps more often than not?
I would say people will generally fail on the whole thing. Like if they're going to fail on the whole thing. And it will stem from a place of just unwillingness to be vulnerable. Some people have a very hard time with not appearing as the authority. They cannot stand to look weak or to look less than perfect. And if that's your reaction, then I would say you need to work on probably certain unmet needs you have. You need to work on your self-image, your confidence. Because if you cannot admit to mistakes you've made in the past, or you can't admit that you have certain weaknesses, which we all do, then this is going to be a problem. Because as our culture continues to grow and evolve in the workplace, most companies are striving for more honesty and more authenticity. You want to keep this in mind.
That's great to hear. So, full disclosure, that weakness was real. I do often struggle to ask people for help, whatever I need to be asking them for help sooner. So it's really good to have a way to put that into a real framework that helps to explain that in a way that a potential employer could better understand and see if we're a good fit. And that workplace or culture is a good fit for that particular candidate.
That's actually a really great example. Do you want to work through that one, for anyone out there listening?
I always love help of this kind.
Okay, so the first step is, you've already mentioned it, right? I know I struggle to ask for help sooner, or what's the statement you want to go with here?
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I really do struggle to ask for help sooner. And I might get into a project and realize I'm in over my head and I should have asked for help a day ago. And that's something I struggle with.
And so then why is this an issue?
I really like doing things, jumping in to things and doing things myself. I have great pride in being able to do something and see those results myself.
Well, what you're explaining is a little bit, I think it's missing the heart of what keeps most people sort of stuck in this, I don't want to ask for help, because you can see the results yourself. But the thing that comes into play when we want to do it all by ourselves and not ask for help is we think we don't get to own those results if we didn't do it by ourselves. Okay, so it's beyond just seeing the results, but it's the feeling of ownership of those results.
That's so true.
Yeah. And so then that's from your perspective. Now tell me how that affects people you have to work with.
If I had, for example, started working with instructional designers sooner than when I'm doing a course build, for example, then I would have had the help and the guidance that would have helped me to move faster on that course build project, for example. So it impacts them in the sense that the entire organization thrives whenever we have great work done right more quickly. And not being able to reach out sooner means that work isn't getting done as efficiently or as well as it could because I'm not working with the help that I need.
Well, that's definitely part of it. But I would say if we're describing the impact this issue has on other people, it's less about you, but like literally your impact on these other people. So what happens when we don't ask for help sooner? We often reach a point where now is real pedal to the metal. It's an emergency. Then what happens? We finally ask for help, but it's like, oh my gosh, I need you to help me now, like today. Can you turn this around by the end of the day? And if you put yourself in those people's shoes, are they going to be happy with you? No, of course not. They're going to be like, what the fuck, Ryan? No.
Why did you bring me a fire when you could have easily come before it was a raging fire, right?
Exactly. So that's the thing. I remember my brother used to do this to me, and it took me a little bit to pinpoint like why I was so upset at him. It's not that I didn't want to help him. Like I absolutely wanted to help him, but he would wait so long that he would make it difficult for me to help him. And that urgency he would have, because he was now putting that responsibility on me to bail him out and to leave me no run time, right? There was no like lead up time. There was no runway to have this. Like it was a completely stressful experience for me. That's what I mean is you have to watch out for the impact your actions have on others. So this is that middle step. Okay. We've already been through acknowledge the issue, explaining on both sides the impact, and then the resolution. So if we're again returning to the same example of asking for help sooner, how are you actually going to do that? Because the kind of like quote unquote dumb answer would be, well, I would just ask for help sooner.
Yeah.
And that's not how this works. Okay.
Okay.
It's like the
That's
question.
exactly the answer I was thinking. So help me understand that. Yes.
I know. So really the question here is, in order for you to actually reach that resolution of asking for help sooner, what are the signs you would need to identify that would then tell you, oh, I need to ask for help now instead of waiting till later?
So in the context of being, someone who highly values autonomy as both a professor and as a business owner and being able to do things myself, I think identifying steps and stages in the project timeline where I would need outside help and looking at my planning and my structures to say, oh, this is where I'm going to need a second opinion every time, as opposed to waiting till maybe a fire starts.
Okay, so I think that is a great start. But now remember, most people who don't like to ask for help, their judgment is a little bit off here. Their judgment on evaluating when they actually need help is a little bit off. So I would recommend, not just for you, but every person out there who kind of falls into this little bucket, is absolutely do that pre-evaluation. Try to pick out those steps where you think you would maybe need help. And I would say go 2 steps earlier. Like actually ask for help 2 steps before the step you've identified and just try that out. See?
I like that. So go to my academic innovation department, go to my instructional designer sooner as a professor, and maybe hire an editor faster for my business, right? The things that you might put off in the project timeline, the things that are sucking the most amount of time, those 2 examples, I think, would be very helped by going a little bit sooner than I thought, asking someone for help.
Yes. And I would say, let's say you lay out like an entire timeline or outline of a project you have to do, and you've identified step 6 as where you need to ask for help. I would say literally go to step 4 where you are thinking you don't need help and go have a conversation with someone at that stage. Just lay it out. Say, this is what I'm working towards. This is what I've done so far. This is where I think I'm, headed. What are your thoughts? What's your perspective? And just get that outside opinion, and then you'll be surprised. That person may help you identify certain things that you need help with that you hadn't even realized. And let's face it, if you're someone who's kind of a soloist, you're very likely not identifying things you need help with.
I can see why people come for that cathartic moment of realizing, wow, this is what it's like to be coached, right? So I appreciate you taking the time to identify those things for me. I appreciate that. It was really nice to have that kind of insight. What are some other mistakes that candidates make, whenever they're in an interview that's high stress like this?
Okay, number 3 on the list, I would say they dead end the conversation. And what I mean by this is, this will happen when they're asked a question, especially that they don't know the answer to. So here's an example. Back when I was working at Amazon, in my interview for a technical writer position, they asked me what I thought of simplified technical English. And I was like, I have no idea what that is. And so a lot of candidates at that point will be like, I don't have any thoughts because I don't know what it is. If they're asked, do you have the skill? They'll just say no. And then the conversation just dies at that point. And that is not going to fly, especially if you're on an interview loop. Okay, so if you're not with just one person who's interviewing you on like every aspect of the job, let's say you go to a bigger company like Microsoft or Amazon, you're placed on what's called a loop. You're probably going to have to talk to 4 to 6 people in one day. Each of those people have had specific amount of time allotted to their portion of your interview. So just imagine if the interviewer is asking you this question and you're like, I don't know. So then they either move on to the next thing, right? And they're leaving like this whole box totally unchecked. It's probably got like a red flag here. You know, this is not how you want to handle that sort of situation. So you can do a couple of things. One, you can try and map it back to the closest thing in your past experience. So for instance, if they say, do you have experience with JavaScript? Well, no, but I actually do have a ton of experience with HTML. That would be an example. And so with HTML, I know the typical challenges are this or this. And then you would want to draw out your strengths that you could then apply that would probably work for this other thing or this other skill you don't have. The other thing you can try is just ask a clarifying question. So for instance, you could just say, well, I'm not sure that I actually know what simplified technical English is. Could you explain a little bit more? And then theoretically, they would tell you what it is. And then you could actually answer the original question. Well, I think that's great. And then you would explain why. So every question you ever get from an interviewer is never going to be just yes or no. You need to say your answer, but then you need to follow up with why. You need to explain your reasoning. Like why or how did you arrive at this answer, right? You need to show your work, just like back when we were in school.
You mentioned asking clarifying questions. Can you speak a little bit more to that point?
So I see candidates not asking enough clarifying questions. And I'll give you an example here. Back at Amazon, I forget what year this was, but this was for one of the interviews I bombed, okay? My person asked me, how would you get to Amazon? And I was thrown by this. I was like, what do you mean? And I said, are you talking about Amazon corporate in downtown or Amazon somewhere else or literally like Amazon River? The forest, like what Amazon are you talking about? I see you laughing, right? And this is the thing. Like the guy was like, he refused to give me any guidance. And so sometimes you'll see that that's actually the point of the question. It doesn't really matter like what the thing is. So at that point, if you get that kind of question from your person, they're trying to just test how you deal with ambiguity. Like what kind of clarity can you bring on your end? But sometimes you'll get a question like this other one. How would you drive business growth? And I see so many people messing up this question where they technically give a good answer, but this is now where they don't understand that the interviewer is actually testing to see if they can even identify what the problem is. So you would want to ask, what kind of business growth? What does growth look like? What level of growth? Like, how would we measure that? You would want to ask some sort of follow-up question like that. And most people never ask. They are just so anxious to demonstrate their value to the interviewer. They just start spouting off information. Well, I would do this and I would do this and I would do this. And I'm like, but hang on a second. Do you even understand what business growth means and in what context?
If people need to ask more questions, how do they know when they've exhausted that question thread and they've asked enough questions to get clarity?
You'll see it from the interviewer's demeanor, right? So if they flat out refuse to answer any of your questions and they're telling you to just go with whatever, like just you pick, then that's them trying to see how you deal with ambiguity. But if they actually do answer your questions, you at some point have to decide when you have enough answers from them. And do not go overboard with these kind of questions, okay? Like at max, you should be asking 2 or 3, no more than 3. And I would say probably stick to 1 or 2 questions clarifying. But it always depends on what role you're interviewing for. So if you're somebody who's, I don't know, interviewing for some kind of statistics job, these details, they could matter. Like they could really matter. Like your entire answer could turn on just a difference in one of these key details. So, you have to know your job.
So I want to make sure that our audience is following along with these 4. Can you summarize the 4 that we've covered so far for anyone who might be joining the conversation?
Of course. So first, number 1, we had candidates who just take too long to get to the point because they're rambling, they're giving too many details. I would say start with the gist, right? Number two is handling that question, what is your greatest weakness, from a place of honesty, vulnerability, and authenticity. Number three are candidates who just dead end the conversation. You can't just say yes or no or I don't know. Always explain your reasoning, like how you got there. And number four are candidates who just don't ask enough clarifying questions. They make the mistake of diving into the answer because they're so anxious to demonstrate their value. And sometimes they're giving an answer that's just out of context because they failed to actually identify like what the actual situation was.
That's a great list. How many more do we have on our list of mistakes that candidates might make in an interview?
I would say I have two more major common mistakes I see made all the time in interviews. Okay, so number five are candidates who aren't demonstrating enough common sense. Okay, they're just not being realistic to the resources they have. So let me give you an example again from Amazon. My team was hiring for another editor on the team. I was on this person's loop, and I'm pretty sure I was the hardest interviewer on this person's loop. Fairly sure I saw, sweat coming out for her. It was not easy, and this is why. I asked her how she would improve the quality of the help articles in the database, and she said she would personally rewrite all the help articles. And I said, okay, well, that's certainly interesting. So my follow-up question was, and what if there are 20,000 articles in the database? What would you do then? This candidate, that should have been the cue, okay? What I said should have been the cue for this candidate, as in to revise her line of thinking. But instead, she doubled down and she said she would rewrite all 20,000 articles to database. And I remember being completely boggled. I was like, is this person for real? And so I tried to help her out. I then gave her another cueing question. I said, okay, well, what if I told you you had all these other projects to work on? You have 5 other projects to work on. Then what would you do? And she stuck to her guns. Now, I'll say there is something admirable about somebody who is just very focused on their method, their process. But at a certain point, you have to realize that when someone keeps giving you these very pointed follow-up questions, they're actually looking for you to demonstrate a different kind of answer, a different line of reasoning, some other type of thinking. And when you fail to take into account real world problems like constrained resources, you don't have unlimited time. You don't have unlimited bodies on your team. And if you have something astronomical like 20,000 articles, how are you then going to prioritize the resources you do have? So it's that question where does your common sense actually kick in? So you do need to demonstrate that in an interview, do you have a good head on your shoulders? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And that whole idea of giving a candidate, I think it reminds me that interviewers are often looking for candidates to succeed. They're not trying to trip them up or trick them. And it's very important for the candidate to listen carefully whenever they're getting feedback from a live interview.
Oh, for sure. For sure. I remember our team at the time, we were so strapped for people. We had so many people quit, the attrition rate was horrendous. And just to give you some context, I was on this team for a year and a half-ish, maybe a little bit more. By the time I left the team, I was the 18th person to quit the team. So you can imagine that turnover rate is really high. And, that holds true across Amazon in general. But when you have a team that has lost so many people, they're quite desperate to hire. They're not looking for you to fail. They just want you to demonstrate the basic sense that the Lord gave you. Okay. So don't forget to bring that to the table with you. This is beyond some of the stuff like the answers you've prepared or the practice that you've put in with your friends or maybe even a coach. Like, remember, you sometimes will have to demonstrate like real world problem solving during the interview. So just keep that in mind. And if all else fails and you're struggling, it's okay to say, can I take a moment to think? And then you want to ask yourself, what's happening and what is this interviewer looking for that I'm not giving them?
I like that. Please give me a moment to think about that, because I think it demonstrates thoughtfulness and a real caring for the process and a respect for the process too, which is nice.
I think that's true, but it also shows confidence. So here's the thing that most people will never do is they'll never pause. Like I said, they're so anxiety ridden that they won't ever take a pause and just take a moment for themselves. And so the truly confident people are the ones who do that. They ask for what they need. It's just a very healthy response.
And something that interviewers are looking for, I'd imagine.
For sure. For sure. Like, I remember this wild story that I once read about Sandra Oh, the actress. Do you know who she is?
Yeah.
Okay. For anybody who doesn't know who she is, she was on Grey's Anatomy. The Korean actress, she has like this beautiful curly hair. And I forget what movie she was auditioning for, but she came in and apparently instead of going into like reading the scene or delivering the lines, whatever the typical audition process is, I'm not an actor, okay? I don't know. She apparently went and just lied on the floor. She just lied down, and it was crazy. And she did that for, I don't know, like 10 minutes or more. And so the director was just sitting there, like watching her. And I'm sure there are a ton of people out there who would be like, what in the heck is this person doing? Maybe they think she's crazy. Maybe they think she's just full of herself. But this director was so impressed by what she did. The fact that she took the time and space she needed. And I'm sure there are other people who would violently disagree here. They'd be like, what are you doing? This isn't how we do things. Get the heck out of here. Sure. But, remember, there are going to be people who will respect the fact that speak up for what you need.
Absolutely. And sometimes it can be intimidating and difficult to speak up, especially whenever you're coming from a place where you need a job, right? And figuring out how to navigate that is a whole other conversation too.
Oh, yeah, because now we're getting into desperation and scarcity, which of course understandable. You have bills to pay, you have student loans to pay. It can be hard. I get that.
Sure. So what is that last mistake that you wanted to cover?
Number 6 is not paying attention to nonverbal cues. I know as a communications coach and professor, like this is your jam, right? So in an interview, you need to pay attention to not just that person's nonverbal cues, but also your own. Okay, so how do you speak? Pay attention to the look on your face. So if you're like me, I suffer from chronic RBF. If you don't know what that is, resting bitch face. So I'm not a very naturally smiley person, not like you, Ryan. And just from a cultural standpoint, many Americans find me intimidating because I'm not smiling. And me, I'm just in my normal self, my normal zone. I'm just thinking, especially in an interview, which, already pointed out is high stress, high stakes. I'm trying to think through my answers carefully. My facial expression is going to be the last thing I'm thinking about. But you need to think about that. You want to make sure your facial cues are at least neutral, not a little bit pleasant. I'm not saying grin like a clown because that's definitely not going to help you. But, watch these things. What about the tone of your voice? Are you one of those people who always speaks as if you're asking a question, even though you're not asking a question, right? And I find that tends to happen from people who are trying to process their thoughts and they know they have more to say, but instead of just taking a pause, they tend to leave like this leading, what do you call it? Like a leading trail to the end. And it's very strange. So for example, if I say, people who don't pay attention to their nonverbal cues, it's weird, right? Because you're not asking a question. But also look at your body language. Are your shoulders relaxed? Are you showing your hands on the table? Which I would say, yes, keep your hands on the table where people can see them. It's one of those unconscious or subconscious cues for trust and honesty. So definitely don't, always hide your hands under the table. If you're standing, keep your hands out of your pockets, which I know men tend to do. Men in general, I find they don't know what to do with their hands, so they stick them in their pockets. Like, stop doing that. But then obviously look at your interviewer. If you see that they are looking a little bit impatient, that probably means you're rambling. You're giving information that's just not helpful, and maybe even worse is boring. So just look at them. And if you see them perhaps twitching a little bit, fidgeting, that's another cue. Like, what's happening? Maybe they're on a time constraint. So if you see something that doesn't make sense or you're uncomfortable, it's okay to just ask, are we still good on time? Am I making sense? Or is there anything that I could clear up? Is there anything I could clarify? Do you need me to go more in depth on any part of what I just said? So just check in with the interviewer.
It's great advice. It reminds me how we often are sharing the stat and the research that for the past 2 decades at least, probably more, the number one skill that is desired amongst most managers is communication skills. And on the top 10 list, like 9 of them are always communication skills, being able to speak in person, being able to give a good presentation, being able to work with others, being able to work in groups, being able to write efficiently. And I would even argue that the one that isn't thought of normally as a communication skill is a communication skill because it takes initiative, right? Which is that kind of more vague thing that, oh, well, that's not really a communication skill. I would argue it is, because I think our communication majors are especially good at taking initiative.
If you notice some kind of expression or unconscious body movement on your interviewer's part, you checking in with them is an example of taking initiative, right? You're taking like the temperature of the room, just making sure that everything is okay. Are we still on track? Is there anything left to clear up? Is there anything that you haven't actually answered for them?
Gosh, are there any other examples of where a candidate could demonstrate taking initiative in the context of the interview itself?
Well, this is sort of like the hidden number 7 tip that I haven't given yet. But since we're talking about this, is when the interviewer gets to the portion that they often do, like towards the end, and they ask you, do you have any questions for me? This is where you should ask real questions. If you ask no questions, that really demonstrates a lack of curiosity on your part. So if we're talking about taking initiative, just making sure that you're staying attuned to the interviewer and demonstrating real interest in this position and the company, then I would say you should always ask some kind of question about what's been the most rewarding part of working with this team? What's something that you think I should know about that isn't immediately apparent on the job description? What is the culture or the team dynamics like? What would you say is the most important skill for someone in this role to have? What would you say is absolutely necessary for success in this role? So those are examples of some of the questions you might want to think about asking. I'm not saying ask all of these questions, just pick one.
Those are great questions to have ready to go in your back pocket, especially as you're leaving and trying to leave a good impression, a good lasting impression on that interview team or that interviewer. What would you say would be the number one thing, the most important thing, the most important action that a candidate should be taking today to prepare for an interview coming up within the next week? You've given us so much. You've given us so many wonderful things to work on. What would you think would be the most important action that you take?
So I would say prepare your answers, but make sure you prepare speaking them. So the other really big gap I find is that when people prepare for an interview and they write down their supposed answers, they're unfortunately writing them as they write and not like how they speak. This means that many of the answers come out sounding completely unnatural, overly corporate-y, overly technical. It's just not how real human beings speak. So just practice reading your answers aloud and see if that feels natural to you. But the bigger test, I would say, is practice reading your answers to other people. So to your friends, your family. If you have like a 10-year-old kid, that's always best. Just see if they actually understand what you're even saying. If they cannot understand what you're saying, that's always a sure sign you are rambling, you have too many details, or you're overly technical, right? So we want to cut out the fluff and we want you to just communicate the main gist. Tell me the bottom line. And then your examples should back up that bottom line. Right? These should be the pieces that fill in the holes. This is where it's really good to bring in numbers. Okay, but always practice like actually speaking these things.
In that statement, you covered both the credibility part of the numbers and the facts, and in the nonverbal answer and the emphasis on nonverbal, you were talking about the warmth that an interviewee or candidate must demonstrate in that short interview time.
I don't know that that's what I would say. I would say warmth would be the ideal piece. You know, you and I were speaking the other day about charisma being power plus intellect plus warmth. But sometimes if you're somebody who leads with one and less the other two, that's okay. My key goal in saying you should really practice speaking your answers to other people is that you should be natural. You should be natural to who you are and not trying to be somebody who's totally like not your normal self.
You've already recapped the first four. Can you recap these last ones the same way you did the first four for our audience?
Sure. So number 5, we had people who aren't demonstrating enough common sense, who aren't taking into consideration like realistic, real world constraints. Number 6 are people just not paying attention to the nonverbal cues for themselves, but also on the interviewer side, right? Like read the room. And number 7, just asking really good questions at the end of the interview. When they ask you, do you have any questions for me? Definitely ask some questions. If you have no questions, doesn't look great for you.
This obviously isn't a job interview, but I wondered, do you have any questions for me, Jule?
How scary was I?
I think people are often intimidated by intellect. And I think that's what it comes down to. The intimidation of intellect.
Well, it's something I've heard all my life. And I'll tell you this because we were just talking about charisma and warmth. You know, you're somebody who just oozes warmth. You know, you have extremely high feedback scores from your students, like consistently every quarter or semester. I'm the complete opposite, right? People routinely tell me how intimidated they were until they got to know me. And you know what? I'm working on that. Like I'm working on incorporating some of those more warmth cues, like changing a little bit of my language, learning to handle small talk more gracefully. But at the end of the day, like these are packaging, right? It's okay to know who you are. And I think that's just me. You know, I've always been fascinated by knowledge. You and I share that in common. We're both class junkies almost. Like we're just obsessed with the joy of learning. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that, but don't forget to connect with your fellow human being. And I would say that's one of your greatest strengths.
I appreciate that so much, Jule. I really do, especially because I do work on the intellect side more. I feel like I got warmed down. I got to work on that intellect side pretty much constantly. So I appreciate you mentioning the course Japanese side of us too. Jule, do you have any questions for me?
Well, now that I've run through all of this, I know I heard you mention earlier that you guys still teach the STAR framework. So since you've had definite experience with coaching students on interviewing and also speech and debate, all of these things, what would you say is the most common mistake you see students making? Just curious.
Yeah. So one of the reasons we teach the STAR framework, and I like the PAR framework, which is problem, action, result. Give me the problem you solved, the action you took, and the result that happened as a result of that action that you took to solve the problem, is because they have that kind of nervousness that often leads to rambling. If we can give them a storytelling framework or something to help anchor their answers as a preparation technique before they go in, I find that incredibly useful. So I was really glad that your very first mistake that you mentioned for most candidates was rambling, because we see that all the time. That's absolutely something that people need to work on before they step into that interview room.
Right? And it's not just rambling. Like sometimes they're actually on topic, but they're simply overwhelming the listener with too many details. And these details don't really matter. And I think this is again where candidates who are so anxious to demonstrate their value, they throw more information in there because they think that's somehow better, but it's not. Like you have to realize, like the more words coming out of your mouth, the more load you're placing on the listener to parse what you've just said and try to place it into context. And that's why I tell people to lead with the bottom line first, right? Like a one sentence summary of what happened and what you did. Because it's kind of like when you're trying to do a jigsaw puzzle, right? It's incredibly hard to make the jigsaw puzzle if you don't know what the picture is supposed to look like. So do your interviewer a favor and give them that picture so they know what and where to place the pieces that you're giving them. Otherwise, it can be very hard.
I remember when I was interviewing and I was in the job of looking for candidates for a specific job, being able to ask questions to be sure that we're setting candidates apart, to say this candidate has this strengths, this candidate has that strengths. That was difficult because we had so many qualified candidates for the job. And I think that what candidates might sometimes fail to realize is that the interviewers are struggling to make sure that they can put you in the right category for this particular job, to say, oh, this one is strong on ABC, this one's strong on XYZ, right? And the more you can do to help them to differentiate you from other candidates, in my opinion, the better. What would you say about that? You think differentiation is important?
I think differentiation is key, but not in the way that you're speaking. So I'm coming from the perspective that most of the candidates who make it to the on-site interview are going to be qualified. So it's not really about your background or your skills at that point. The differentiator, I think, is how comfortable and how clearly you can articulate their answers to any of these questions. And to me, that's the thing. Okay, so if you make it past all of the phone screens, the actual application process, you get to an on-site interview, what a lot of people fail to understand is the thing they're actually looking for. And this is why they call them behavioral questions. They're looking for a fit. So can you communicate? Can you actually summarize to like a nutshell, like what the thing did was? So it's less about your actual skills and your past job history. It's more, can you just articulate what it was you did?
Can you articulate what you did well, right? That articulation skill that is so important. I understand that you have articulated a book. Can you tell us a little bit about this book that you've done, Jule?
Oh man, I really like that lead in you did. Real smooth, Ryan. I appreciate that. So I am a first-time author, published Self-Love, Affirmations, and Reflections. I'm holding it up, which you cannot see unless you're watching this on Ryan's YouTube channel. And this collection is a set of 52 cards that aren't just affirmations, but every card has a backside. And I'll show you one of these. So funny story here. I'm actually somebody who does not believe in affirmations. I find that for most people, they don't do the job. It's really more like pretty words that end up feeling like you're lying to yourself. That's because the underlying issues have not been solved. Okay, so on one side, you get an affirmation, but on the other side, you get an entire reflection piece, which is that part that helps you build the bridge to where you are now, to where affirmation is suggesting.
I'm so excited for you. Can you show that box cover again, that book cover, the deck cover? Because I thought that was really cool looking. Did you design that?
Here you go. I did not design this. This was designed by the amazing team at Zeitgeist or Penguin Random House. So Zeitgeist is an imprint of Penguin Random House. They have a team of designers and they put this together. So I didn't have to do any of this.
This is fantastic. So happy for you in that you've begun your journey as a published author. So where can they find this new book that you have written?
But you can find them on Amazon, online in the US and Canada, all across Europe, most of the major Amazon countries. But in addition, You might also be able to find them in an Urban Outfitters near you. So Urban Outfitters has picked up these affirmation cards, so you might see them there.
And Jule, where can we find you online?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, Jule Kim, you'll find me, or also on my website, seattlelifecoach.org. Thank you, Ryan.
And thank you again, Jule, for sharing your expertise and your advice for interview candidates. And again, congratulations on publishing that book.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.